The Haunting of Hobo Hill, a family's nightmare in Missouri. I never believed in curses that cling to a house like damp air to rotten wood. I never thought walls could hold memories of agony, or that something unseen could stalk the living in their sleep. When we moved into the big old house on Hobo Hill in Jefferson City, Missouri, I carried nothing but eagerness and the sense that we had stumbled into a dream of high ceilings, sprawling rooms, and a property that whispered of history. It was supposed to be the place where my family settled, where laughter would fill the halls. But what I found instead was a nightmare that unfolded slowly, seeping into every breath, every shadow, every quiet hour of the night. The house had a presence from the beginning, though I could not name it at first. The air felt heavier when we crossed the threshold, like the walls themselves had been waiting. The wood carried an old scent, dust and varnish mingled with something sour, almost metallic, the faint edge of rust or dried blood. I told myself it was only the smell of age, of time clinging to timber. But beneath it, there was another note, like the odor of stagnant water left to rot in a hidden corner. That smell never faded, no matter how many windows I opened. At night, the stillness of the house pressed against me. It had a sound of its own, not just the settling of old beams, but something deliberate. A slow tap, like fingers drumming far above in the attic. Then the scrape of something heavy sliding across wood, pausing, then shifting again. The first night it happened, I lay awake listening, convincing myself it was just the bones of the house adjusting with the night air. But the sounds returned each night, always around the same time, 11:15, as though some invisible schedule had been carved into the house itself. It wasn't just me who noticed. The dog, our pit bull with a chest like stone and a bark that shook the street, refused to climb the staircase after dark. He would sit at the bottom step, ears pinned back, growling at the shadows above as if daring them to come down. No coaxing could move him. His nails scratched at the floor, his body trembling though nothing visible stood before him. Animals know. They see what we cannot, and his refusal became my first unspoken warning. The rooms upstairs were colder than the rest of the house. Not just chilly, but filled with an unnatural chill that clung to the skin even in midsummer. My breath fogged once when I opened the door to the attic, the kind of fog you expect in deep winter, not July. The wood up there groaned under my weight, and the air smelled like mildew mixed with burnt paper. I remember running my hand along one of the rafters and pulling it back blackened, as if soot still lingered though no fire had touched the place in decades. That attic became the center of everything, the heart of what would consume us. The first time I saw it, it was not a full figure, only a sliver of black in the corner of my eye. A shape darker than the shadows it stood within, gone the instant I turned. But the dread it left was physical, sinking into my stomach, tightening my chest. That night I dreamed of a tall figure standing over me, its face blurred, its breath sour with decay. I woke with my body damp in cold sweat, the memory still hovering like smoke I couldn't wave away. My child began to change not long after. She was 7, bright and curious, always quick with a smile. But in that house, her nights grew restless. I woke to find her wandering the hallway, eyes glassy, lips moving with words that were not her own. Not words of English, not words I knew. They hissed and rolled like syllables from an older tongue, guttural and sharp. When I tried to hold her, she stiffened, her face contorted in a grimace that did not belong to her. It was only when the first light of morning touched the windows that she would soften again, her memories erased, as if sleepwalking explained everything. But I knew better. I could hear the echo of those words long after they left her lips, clinging like a curse in the air. It wasn't only her. I began to feel touches where none should be. A hand brushing my shoulder in the attic when I knew I was alone. Fingers grazing the back of my neck while I washed dishes. Sometimes it was only pressure, sometimes heat, sometimes a cold that burned worse than fire. The worst came one evening when I bent to pick something from the floor, and an unseen force pressed down on my back, pinning me until I gasped for air. The weight lifted suddenly, leaving me collapsed on the floor, shaking, the dog whining at the doorway too afraid to enter. The walls whispered. I cannot describe it any other way. If I pressed my ear to the plaster, I could hear them, low murmurs like dozens of voices humming all at once, too faint to separate into words, too constant to be the wind. Sometimes a single voice rose above the others, harsh and mocking, as though it knew I was listening. And in the darkest hours, those whispers grew into laughter, brittle and cruel, echoing through the house until I wanted to tear my ears from my head just to escape them. The house drained us. My wife grew pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She spoke less, stared more, as though her thoughts were being stolen piece by piece. I found her once sitting in the dark kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at the wall, lips parted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched like I had wrenched her from a trance. She never told me what she heard, but the silence in her eyes was worse than words could have been. I tried everything to banish it. Holy water sprinkled across doorframes, prayers whispered into empty rooms. A crucifix hung above the child's bed. But the house mocked these efforts. The crucifix fell one night, split clean down the center, as though cut by invisible hands. The water turned stagnant within days, leaving a sour smell that stained the air. Faith seemed powerless here, like light swallowed by an endless void. The attic became unbearable. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like nails clawing at the beams. A figure began to linger at the edge of the stairwell, tall and formless, watching with patience that chilled me more than violence ever could. One night, desperate, I climbed into the attic with a flashlight. The beam cut through dust and cobwebs, illuminating empty rafters. But the light flickered, died, and in that moment of darkness I felt breath against my ear, hot, rancid, whispering a word that froze my heart, mine. I stumbled down the stairs, legs weak, and never entered the attic again. By the 7th month, we were no longer a family but shadows of ourselves. My wife's silence deepened into despair. My child grew thin, her sleep filled with muttering and jerking movements. I avoided mirrors because sometimes, for the briefest second, the reflection staring back was not my own. The dog refused the house altogether, spending his nights outside, whining at the windows as though pleading for us to leave. And so we did. We left that house behind with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the knowledge that some places are not meant for the living. Some walls hold the weight of tragedies long past, feeding on whoever dares to enter. Hobo Hill was never ours. It belonged to something older, darker, something that claimed us the moment we crossed its threshold. Even now, years later, I feel it has not released me. Some nights, at exactly 11:15, I wake in my new home to the sound of tapping above me. A slow scrape, the shifting of something heavy, and the faint echo of whispers bleeding through the walls. The house on Hobo Hill may be far behind, but the nightmare follows. Always. Specters on the baby monitor, ghostly encounters caught on camera. I used to believe technology was a safeguard. A screen, a camera, a lens capturing the most private corners of life. Proof that nothing lurked where my eyes could not see. I thought a baby monitor was just another tool, something to give a parent peace of mind. I never considered it might reveal more than I ever wanted to witness, or that its faint green glow could turn into a portal to something I could not understand, let alone control. The night it began, everything felt ordinary. My child was barely 6 months old, fragile, wrapped in sleep within the cradle. The monitor sat on the nightstand beside me, its tiny screen humming with static light. The image showed the faint shape of her chest rising and falling, the background drowned in grayscale shadows. I let that glow soothe me to sleep, believing that any disturbance would wake me instantly. But what I woke to was not what I expected. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I opened my eyes, the room suffused with a dim blue wash from the monitor. I noticed it first as a flicker, like a distortion across the image. Lines rippling down the screen, as if static had licked at the edges. Then, within those faint waves, movement. Something hovering at the side of the cradle, something taller, darker than the rest of the grainy light. At first I thought it was a trick of my half-sleep. I leaned closer, rubbing my eyes, blaming fatigue. But the shape did not vanish. It stood there, hazy yet undeniable, stooped over the crib like a shadow leaning in to watch. My pulse throbbed hot in my ears. I wanted to believe it was a glitch, that the camera was catching some distortion, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted its weight, the bend of its figure leaning further until its head hovered inches above my daughter's. I tore my gaze away, forcing myself to look across the room, expecting to see nothing but emptiness. And that's exactly what was there. Just silence, the crib in the next room unseen, my bedroom still and cold. But when I turned back to the monitor, the figure remained, watching, leaning. My skin prickled with a crawling sensation, as though invisible threads dragged across my arms. I could almost feel breath that wasn't there, warm and stale against the side of my face. The camera had no microphone, and yet in that silence I swore I heard something faint. An irregular hiss, not static, not mechanical, but the ragged sound of air forced between teeth. The next night it returned. The shape shifted from the far corner of the screen this time, swaying like it struggled against a heavy weight. I noticed details I had missed before. Limbs too long, bending wrong, hands stretched in shapes that seemed to end in crooked points. And still, that lean over the crib, as though it was endlessly fascinated by the rise and fall of my child's tiny chest. Sometimes the monitor brightened, almost too much, as though the unseen figure reflected light that wasn't there. My daughter stirred in those moments, whimpering in her sleep, hands twitching against the blanket. She never cried, not fully, but she seemed caught in some dream deeper than she should have been, her eyelids fluttering like frantic moth wings. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than interference, perhaps a signal from a neighbor's electronics bleeding through. That was the only rational answer I could conjure. But rationality crumbled when the marks appeared. It was the third morning. I found her lying calm, almost unnervingly so, but across her cheeks stretched a thin line of purple, like a scratch pressed into skin. My first thought was that she had done it herself, her nails still too sharp despite my trimming. But the line was too straight, too deliberate, like a finger dragged with intention. It cut across her face from temple to jaw, deep enough to leave a welt, but too precise to be accidental. The monitor the night before had shown nothing clear, only the figure leaning closer than ever, its head tilting as though inspecting her. I could not shake the feeling that what I found on her skin in the morning was a mark left by whatever lingered in that image. From then on, the nights grew worse. The monitor seemed alive, as though it wanted me to see. Static blossomed into shapes that shifted in patterns, like multiple figures moving in and out of the frame. At times, I counted 3 shadows where only one should have been, their forms twitching and folding in ways that made my stomach knot. They never touched her, not on screen, but always they leaned, swaying with a hunger that did not need words. The house itself began to change. Footsteps padded across the hallway in the hours before dawn. Not hurried, not frantic, but slow and measured, as though whoever walked there wanted to be heard. I would sit frozen in bed, the monitor glowing beside me, the sounds above and around blending into a chorus of dread. Sometimes the footsteps ended just outside my door. A pause, a wait, the kind of silence that presses until your lungs forget to move. There were smells too, the faint sweetness of rot, like fruit left too long in a closed drawer, seeping in without source. At other times it was sharper, acrid, like metal scorched and cooled again. The air would thicken with it, choking, until the moment passed and all was still once more. I began to dread sleep, not for myself, but because sleep meant trusting the night, trusting that my child would not wake to something standing over her. Yet exhaustion is merciless. It drags you down regardless of fear. And when I did close my eyes, the dreams came. Dreams where I saw the nursery not through my own eyes, but through the green glow of the monitor. Dreams where the shadows were no longer grainy, but sharp and clear. Figures crouched beside the crib, faceless but intent, their hands reaching, pausing just before touching her. I wanted to scream, to move, but in the dream I was locked, forced to watch as they circled her like carrion birds waiting for her breath to falter. I woke more than once with my heart slamming against my ribs, the taste of iron in my mouth, my ears ringing with the echo of faint laughter. Not joyful, not human, but the brittle rasp of something finding amusement in suffering. There came a night when I could no longer bear it. I set the monitor aside, determined to trust my own ears, my own vigilance. I lay in bed, staring into the dark, listening to every creak, every shift of the air. For hours nothing happened. The silence lulled me into the fragile edge of sleep. Then the scream tore me awake. Not from her, not from the nursery, but from the monitor itself. Though it was turned off, the device shrieked with a burst of static so loud it rattled the nightstand. I snatched it up with trembling hands, the screen flickering alive without power, showing an image I wish I could erase. The crib was empty. The blankets lay undisturbed, but she was gone. In her place, the screen showed a figure crouched low, its limbs folded beneath it like a spider, its head twisted too far, its grin a pale gash across the static. It stared straight into the lens, straight at me, as though it knew exactly where I sat. I dropped the monitor, heart collapsing, and rushed into the nursery. She was there, asleep, breathing, unharmed, the crib exactly as it should be. And yet when I looked back at the monitor, still buzzing faintly on the floor, the image lingered a second longer before the screen went black. After that night, I could no longer stay. The house, the monitor, the very walls felt poisoned. I packed what little I could carry and fled. Even now, in the safety of another place, I cannot shake the fear that what appeared in those screens was not confined to that house. That it was never the walls or the air, but something drawn to the act of watching. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that glow again. The grain of the camera, the faint sound of static, the weight of unseen eyes pressing from the other side. And in the stillness of night, when the silence is too deep, I feel it. The certainty that somewhere beyond my sight, something is still watching, waiting. The spirit of Yankee Jim, terror in a San Diego house. I never thought the weight of history could press itself into a room the way it did that night. They told me the house was old, but age alone wasn't what lingered in the air. The place carried a heaviness, like a stone pressing against your chest, making every breath shallow. It wasn't the creak of the wooden floorboards, nor the scent of aged dust clinging to the walls. It was something deeper, something buried within the bones of the house itself, as if the very beams had been saturated with memory and suffering. The first time I stepped into the San Diego house where Yankee Jim had supposedly taken his final breath, I noticed how the light struggled to exist there. The late afternoon sun should have streamed easily through the glass panes, yet it seemed muted, dulled into a pale glow that couldn't banish the shadows. The air carried the faint odor of rust and mildew, as though the past had never been properly cleaned away. Each inhale filled my lungs with a metallic sharpness, like breathing through damp iron bars. The stairs were the worst. Narrow, steep, each step rising higher than a comfortable climb. I knew the history. Yankee Jim, the drifter accused of grand larceny, dragged here in chains and hanged just above these very boards. His feet had scraped against the steps, it was said, clawing against them in a futile attempt to escape his noose. That story lodged itself inside my mind, twisting every creak of the stairs into something more than wood. It became the echo of struggle, the desperate friction of life clawing against inevitability. That night I decided to stay, as foolish as it now sounds. The house was empty except for me, my recording equipment, and the endless hum of silence that seemed alive with anticipation. I set the devices carefully, A static camera trained on the staircase, a digital recorder in the parlor, and a spirit box resting in the hall. The faint buzz of electronics gave me a sliver of comfort, but it also felt like bait, like dangling a morsel in dark waters and waiting for something to bite. As the sun sank, the walls seemed to thicken. Shadows gathered in the corners like living creatures, pooling where the dim yellow light of my lantern could not reach. The house was quiet in the way a held breath is quiet, not an absence of sound, but the promise of something waiting to break it. I wandered the narrow halls, tracing my fingers along faded wallpaper that crumbled like old parchment under my touch. The walls were cool, colder than they should have been. Every time my skin brushed them, it felt like touching stone that had lain underground for centuries. The first sound came just past midnight. Not a bang, not a crash, simply the slow drag of something heavy moving across the floor above me. My lantern flame flickered, bending unnaturally as though pulled by an unseen hand. The air turned damp, oppressive, with a faint smell of stagnant water and rusted chains. I froze at the bottom of the staircase, my body unwilling to climb, yet my mind unwilling to retreat. The recorder hissed faintly from the parlor, a hollow electronic breath filling the silence. I forced myself up the steps. Each rise groaned beneath me, the sound echoing in unnatural ways, as if it would stretch the noise beyond the limits of the house. Halfway up, I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, sharp and violent, like walking into a freezer. My breath clouded in front of me, white vapor twisting like smoke in the lantern light. And then, faint but undeniable, I heard the sound of shackles. The metallic clink of chain dragged slowly, rhythmically, across the boards above me. When I reached the landing, the house shifted. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied. The shadows pressed closer, no longer content to linger in corners, but creeping along the walls and ceiling, converging toward me like predators circling prey. My skin crawled with static, each hair lifting, as if in recognition of something unseen brushing too close. The spirit box crackled to life behind me, though I hadn't turned it on. Its hollow scanning noise filled the hall, fragments of words buried inside the static. For a moment it was just nonsense, half-syllables, meaningless scraps, but then something clearer pushed through, a guttural voice, deep and strained, rasping with a weight that felt older than the walls themselves. "Get out." The words scraped against my spine like a blade. I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me. They carried me deeper into the upstairs corridor, toward the room where they said Yankee Jim's spirit lingered. The smell of iron thickened, mingled now with the sour tang of sweat and earth. My head swam, each breath growing heavier, as though the air no longer carried enough oxygen. Inside the room, the shadows did not behave like shadows should. They pulsed faintly, almost as though the walls themselves were breathing. The floorboards beneath me shuddered with an uneven rhythm, like the beating of a great heart buried just beneath the surface. I raised my lantern, and for a brief second thought I saw it. The silhouette of a man, impossibly tall, hanging in the far corner. His head lolled to one side, neck twisted, a rope that wasn't really there cutting deep into flesh that wasn't fully formed. The sight vanished in the blink of an eye, but the weight of it remained. My skin burned cold, and I realized tears had welled in my eyes without me noticing, not from fear but from a suffocating sadness that wasn't mine. It was despair, raw and choking, pressed into me by something that wanted me to feel what he had felt. I stumbled back, nearly toppling over the uneven boards. The lantern swung wildly, scattering light across the walls, and for a fraction of a second, dozens of faces seemed to stare back at me from the wallpaper. Faces stretched, twisted, mouths open in eternal silence. When the lantern steadied, they were gone, leaving only peeling patterns of faded design. The spirit box howled again, static roaring like a storm, and beneath it a scream tore through the air. It wasn't human. It was too guttural, too long, rising into a pitch that rattled the very glass in the windows. My lantern extinguished, leaving me in perfect blackness. I couldn't see, but I could feel it. A presence closing around me, inches from my skin. The weight of unseen eyes bore into me, filled with fury, grief, and something far darker, something that wasn't just human tragedy but hunger. The sound of chains clattered inches from my ears, each clink vibrating through my skull as though shackled to my very bones. I fled. I don't remember deciding to, but my body surged into motion, tearing down the stairs 2-3 steps at a time. The house shook around me, walls groaning, wood splintering as though some massive weight pressed down from above. I crashed through the front door into the night air, stumbling into the damp grass, gasping as though I'd been drowning for hours. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, its windows staring like black eyes, indifferent and unblinking. The air outside was warm again, the scent of night-blooming jasmine drifting faintly on the breeze. It should have calmed me, but it didn't, because as I stood there, trembling, I heard it one last time. The faint metallic rattle of chains, drifting from the darkness of the doorway, followed by a low, guttural laugh that didn't belong to anything living. And in that moment I understood. The house didn't care that I left. It didn't need me, because once you breathe its air, once you step into its shadows, it never truly lets you go. Yankee Jim was still there, chained to the wood, and now some part of me always would be too. Inside McKamey Manor, the haunted attraction that feels like torture. I had heard of McKamey Manor long before I ever set foot near it. The name itself circulated like a curse whispered on internet forums, a haunted attraction so extreme that no one could finish it. The challenge promised money to anyone who could endure it, yet the list of those who tried and failed was longer than the legends attached to the place. They said it wasn't just an attraction. They said it was a psychological collapse disguised as entertainment. And when I finally decided to see for myself, I realized how naive I had been to think it was only an illusion. The house itself did not sit in the woods like some Gothic mansion, nor did it stand proudly in the middle of town. It was tucked away, quiet and unassuming, hidden behind an unremarkable gate on a stretch of land that seemed to resist being found. When I arrived, the air already carried a weight, not the playful anticipation of thrills and scares, but the solemn heaviness of a graveyard. Even outside the gates, I smelled it, a faint mix of mold, stagnant water, and rusted metal. The scent carried the memory of basements and confinement, places without windows or escape. I signed the waiver. 40 pages, stacked like a legal document condemning me to something I couldn't fully imagine. The pen trembled in my hand as I initialed each clause, each line that stripped away my rights, reminding me that whatever waited inside was not bound by the usual expectations of safety. By the time I reached the final page, my name written in shaky ink, it felt like I had already surrendered. The moment the gate closed behind me, the world outside ceased to exist. The air thickened, clinging to my skin like damp cloth, and a silence fell so complete it swallowed the sound of my own breathing. I stepped forward into darkness, the ground beneath me slick with mud and unseen liquid. The faint smell of rotting leaves mingled with iron, a sharp tang that burned at the back of my throat. The first room wasn't a room at all, but a coffin of sound and pressure. A black hood dropped over my head, smothering the last traces of light. I couldn't see, but I could feel the suffocating heat pressing against my face. The fabric reeked of sweat, mildew, and old breath, as though hundreds of others had worn it before me. My chest tightened. Each inhale tasted like decay. Fingers, rough and cold, gripped my arms and dragged me forward, forcing my feet to stumble over uneven ground. The disorientation was instant and complete. I lost all sense of direction. I couldn't tell whether I was indoors or outside, whether the air brushing my skin was from vents or from the open night. All I knew was the texture. Slick walls brushing my arms, gritty dirt against my palms when I stumbled, something wet soaking into my knees when I fell. The stench grew stronger the deeper I was led, mold, iron, and something sourly sweet, like meat left too long in the heat. When the hood finally lifted, I almost wished it hadn't. The room was narrow, walls painted in flaking red that glistened as though still wet. A single bulb flickered above me, casting weak light that swung with every draft of unseen air. The floor was coated in a film of water and grime, reflecting the bulb in distorted ripples. Somewhere nearby, water dripped rhythmically, each splash echoing as though in a cavern. I tried to steady myself, but my body betrayed me. My hands trembled uncontrollably, my legs weak beneath me, every instinct in me screaming to leave. Yet the path forward was the only path offered. Behind me, the darkness loomed like a mouth ready to swallow me if I dared turn back. The next chamber was colder, so cold that my breath clouded visibly, curling white into the stagnant air. The walls sweated moisture, beads of condensation rolling down like tears. The stink here was worse, layered with ammonia and copper, sharp enough to sting my nostrils. On the ground lay objects I couldn't fully identify in the flickering light, ropes, metal restraints, cages too small for any living thing to fit comfortably inside. I told myself it was theater, props, nothing more. But when I brushed against one of the restraints, I felt the stickiness of dried fluid against the rusted metal, tacky beneath my fingertips. It wasn't paint. It wasn't fake. The cold realization slid into me like a knife. Deeper in, the sounds began. Not mechanical, not staged screams, but whispers. Low, guttural, seeping from the walls themselves. At first they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the flickering bulb. But they grew louder, distinct, until they filled the space with a chorus of incomprehensible muttering. My skin prickled. The whispers seemed to know me, calling out in tongues I couldn't understand, yet still recognizing the intent. They weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to me. The air shifted again, thicker now, damp like a swamp. A foul odor flooded the corridor, a blend of sewage and rot so strong my stomach convulsed. I gagged, my throat tightening as bile burned at the back of my tongue. Each step forward became agony, not because of what I saw, but because of what I smelled, what I tasted in the air. Then came the water. I didn't walk into it. It rose around me, first seeping around my ankles, cold and sticky, then climbing higher with each step until it lapped against my thighs. The liquid was thick, not clear water but murky, warm in patches, cold in others. It clung to me, coating my skin with a film that smelled unmistakably of blood. The light above flickered once, twice, then went out. Darkness swallowed me whole. In that void, the sound of chains filled the space, dragging, rattling, clinking closer and closer. Something brushed past me, slick and unyielding, gliding along my arm before vanishing beneath the water. My pulse thundered so loudly I could no longer hear the whispers, only the pounding rhythm inside my skull. Hands erupted from the water. Not real hands, not flesh and blood, but colder than ice, clutching at my wrists, my ankles, my throat. They didn't pull me under. They didn't need to. The terror itself suffocated me more effectively than drowning ever could. I wrenched free, stumbling into another corridor, drenched and shivering. The stench followed me, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The whispers had stopped, but silence brought no relief. It was worse. Silence meant something was waiting. At last, I stumbled into the final chamber. Or perhaps it wasn't the last. Perhaps it was only where my memory chose to stop. The room was nothing but mirrors, tall and streaked, each one warped just enough to twist my reflection into something unrecognizable. I stared at myself, but it wasn't me staring back. The eyes were sunken, black where pupils should have been. The mouth opened in a grin too wide, teeth too many. The reflections didn't mimic me. They moved on their own. I staggered back, and every reflection leaned closer, pressing their palms to the glass, fogging it with breath I couldn't hear but could feel against my skin. My chest seized. I felt them closing in, not just on the other side, but around me, pressing from every angle. And then nothing. No memory of leaving. No recollection of the door or the exit. Just the sickening realization that when I opened my eyes again, I was outside the gates, collapsed in the dirt, the sun already rising. My clothes were drenched, my body sore and bruised as if I'd been dragged for miles. No one believed me when I told them what I had seen. They laughed, said it was just the show, just McKamey Manor doing what it does. But I know what I felt. The smell of blood never left me. Even now, days later, it clings faintly to my skin no matter how many showers I take. The whispers linger at the edge of sleep, soft, beckoning, reminding me that I hadn't escaped anything. I left the manor, but part of me never did. Something followed. Something still waits. And when I close my eyes, I see those reflections, not trapped in mirrors anymore, but standing in the corners of my room, smiling too wide, their whispers promising that the manor never ends once it has you. It only begins.